The shot was logged as a miss. That was the first lie. The second lie came 40 minutes later, when a man named Harlan Vose signed a field report confirming that Specialist Tessa Rourke had been extracted safely from the mountain. He signed it in blue ink. He used his left hand because his right was still shaking. Tessa was not extracted safely. Tessa was not extracted at all. What Vose did was close the radio channel, look out at the Hindu Kush ridgeline dissolving into early dark, and decide that one woman who knew too much was a problem that the altitude and the cold would eventually solve. He drove back to the forward operating base. He ate dinner. He filed the paperwork. For 11 days, no one looked for her. The mountain was called Ko-e-Sork by the locals, which translated roughly to Red Mountain, though by November it ran gray and bone white above the tree line. At 3,840 meters, the air was thin enough that mistakes in arithmetic cost lives. Tessa Rourke had known that since her first deployment. She had been making calculations at altitude since she was 26 years old, and she was 31 now, and the math had never failed her. The mission itself had been simple on paper. 6 hours, in and out. She was attached as a technical advisor to a joint reconnaissance element tasked with observing a supply corridor used by a network that had no official name in any document she had ever been allowed to read. Her job was not to engage. Her job was to watch, to record distances, to verify coordinates against the satellite data that kept being wrong in ways that someone in an office somewhere clearly did not want investigated. She had brought her own notebook. Moleskin, black cover, the kind you could buy at any airport bookstore. Inside it, she had been writing numbers for 4 days, distances, timestamps, GPS coordinates compared against what the official maps said those coordinates should be. The divergence was not random. The divergence was consistent, and consistent meant deliberate, and deliberate meant someone had altered the mapping data, and altered mapping data over a supply corridor meant the corridor was being protected. She understood what she was carrying before she reached the extraction point. She understood it better when the helicopter didn't come. She waited 4 hours at the LZ. The protocol was 2. After 2 hours, you began to consider mechanical failure, weather, communication breakdown, the innocent explanations that keep people from thinking the unthinkable too quickly. After 4 hours, the innocent explanations run out. Tessa did not panic. Panic at 3,800 meters was its own kind of death sentence, and she had trained too long and too hard to hand anyone that particular gift. What she did was methodical. She checked her equipment, she assessed her water, she counted her rations, and she looked at the notebook in her chest pocket and made a decision about what it was worth. Worth enough to keep, worth enough to die for, possibly. She hadn't decided yet about that second part. The temperature dropped to -14 that first night. She found a rock formation on the eastern face that blocked the wind from 2 directions and spent the night pressed against granite, breathing slowly, conserving heat, the way she had been taught in a course at Fort Bragg that most people treated as optional. Tessa had not treated it as optional. She had never treated anything as optional. That was the thing about her that people consistently underestimated and consistently regretted. By day 3, she had moved 11 kilometers east along the ridge, mostly at night, using the stars for navigation and the terrain for cover. Her radio was functioning, but she was not using it. If the extraction had been deliberately aborted, and she was operating on that assumption now, because the alternative was to assume incompetence at a scale that strained credulity, then anyone monitoring the channel would know her position the moment she transmitted. She ate half rations. She drank snowmelt filtered through the cloth of her jacket sleeve. She kept moving. On the morning of day 5, she found the cache. It was buried under a cairn of specific stones. 3 flat, 1 rounded, 1 with a natural white vein running diagonal, the kind of arrangement that looked accidental to anyone who hadn't been briefed on it. Tessa had been briefed on it in a different context, a different mission, a different year. The cache was not hers. It belonged to a network of emergency resources pre-positioned by a logistics unit she had worked alongside briefly in 2021, a unit that had since disbanded and its personnel scattered across assignments that looked, from the outside, like ordinary career rotations. Inside the cache, a secondary radio sealed in a waterproof case, emergency rations, a flare kit, and a folded piece of paper with a set of numbers written in a hand she did not recognize. The numbers were map coordinates. Current ones, not the altered official data. Real coordinates. Someone had left that cache, knowing someone might need it. Someone had left those coordinates, knowing someone might survive long enough to use them. She did not know who. She did not need to know, not yet. What she needed was to reach the position the coordinates indicated and find out what was there. It took her 3 more days. What was there was a man named Aldrich Pham, who was sitting in a shallow cave eating a protein bar with the methodical patience of someone who had been waiting for a very long time and had decided to simply wait. He looked up when she came around the rock face. He did not reach for the weapon beside him. He said, "In English, you're 6 days late," Tessa said. "There were complications." "There always are," Pham said. He stood up. He was roughly her height, lean in the way that fieldwork made people lean, with the kind of stillness in his face that came either from extensive training or from having run entirely out of fear a long time ago. She suspected both. "Are you injured? Superficially? The notebook?" She looked at him for a long moment. "Who are you?" "Someone who has been trying to document the same thing you've been documenting," he said. "For longer, with less success until now." He held out his hand, not for the notebook but in introduction. "Aldrich Pham, Defense Intelligence Agency. Officially, I'm listed as killed in action in a vehicle accident outside Kandahar 18 months ago." Tessa did not shake his hand immediately. She was running the math on what he'd just told her, the way she always ran math, checking it from 3 angles before she trusted the result. "You went dark voluntarily," she said. "The alternative was to actually be dead," Pham said, "which someone was working very hard to arrange." She shook his hand. His story took most of the night to tell, and hers took the rest of it. By the time the eastern sky was beginning to consider the idea of dawn, they had mapped between them something that neither of them had been able to see alone. It started with the supply corridor, the one Tessa had been watching. But it didn't start there, not really. It started 4 years earlier, with a construction contract for a forward logistics facility in a province that had no strategic value, except that it sat on top of a road that connected 3 border crossings. The contract had been awarded to a consortium that existed on paper but dissolved in practice into a series of shell companies, and the money that moved through those shell companies was not purely American. It was partly American. The rest came from sources that the official documentation carefully declined to name. The facility was built, the facility was used, and the facility was used for things that were not in any contract, and those things generated records, and the records had to go somewhere, and where they went was onto a server that was theoretically air-gapped, but that had, through a sequence of decisions that looked like incompetence and smelled like coordination, developed a very small and very specific connection to an external network. Pham had found the connection. He had started pulling the thread, and then his vehicle had gone off a road outside Kandahar, and the official report said driver error, and Pham had decided that the best thing to do was agree with the official report and disappear. He had spent 18 months in the region, off-grid, moving carefully, collecting pieces. He had put coordinates in emergency caches across 3 provinces, trusting that if anyone else was running the same thread, they would find them. Tessa had found them. "How much of this is in your notebook?" he asked. "Enough to establish the coordinate divergence," she said, "which establishes that the mapping data was altered, which establishes intent." "That's the foundation," Pham said. "I have the structure on top of it." He produced a device from inside his jacket. Not a phone, something older and more specific, a data recorder of the type used by intelligence units when they needed something that wouldn't show up on standard equipment manifests. "Everything I've documented, encrypted. The decryption key is in a location I will tell you when we're somewhere I'm confident isn't monitored." Tessa looked at the device. Then she looked at him. "Who do we bring this to?" "That," Pham said quietly, "is the question I have been asking for 18 months. The problem with the question was that the network they had mapped was not external. It was not a foreign operation running against American interests. It was American interests, or a version of them, The version that existed in the space between official policy and unofficial practice, staffed by people who had been inside the system long enough to understand exactly where the walls were thin. Harlan Vos was not the top of it. He wasn't even close to the top. He was an implementation detail, the kind of person who got paid to make problems disappear at the operational level without needing to understand why the problems existed. He had signed Tessa's death warrant the way you sign a form, mechanically, because someone above him had indicated that this was the appropriate thing to do. Above Vos was a woman named Carolyn Streck, who held a position in the Defense Logistics Agency that sounded administrative and was not. Above Streck was a deputy assistant secretary whose name appeared in no records that Tessa or FAM had been able to access directly, but whose fingerprints were on the shape of every decision that had been made. You could see the decisions without seeing the person. That was the design. The operation had a name inside its own documentation, which FAM had accessed partially. The name was Whiteframe. Tessa wrote it in her notebook under the coordinates, then looked at it for a moment. 11 days, she said. That's how long I've been out here. 11 days, FAM confirmed. They'll have adjusted their assumptions about me by now. Yes, they'll think the mountain finished what Vos started. Almost certainly. She closed the notebook. She looked out at the light coming over the eastern ridge, the kind of hard, clean light that existed only above a certain altitude, the kind that showed you everything clearly and without mercy. Then we have a window, she said, a small one. Before they recalibrate. FAM nodded slowly. I have a contact, he said. Someone outside the normal channels. Someone who has been trying to build a case from the outside, from the legal side, and who has been missing the operational documentation to make it actionable. Doubly who? Her name is Dr. Renata Kwan. She's at Georgetown. She spent 12 years as a JAG officer before she went into academic work. She publishes on military contracting law and has never published anything that matters to the people inside Whiteframe, which means they've never looked hard at her. He paused. She's been waiting for someone to survive long enough to bring her something real. Tessa was quiet for a moment. The mountain was quiet too, the way high places are quiet, not empty, but self-contained, indifferent to the things happening on its surface. How do we get out? She said. Carefully, FAM said, and not together. They separated at a road junction 20 kilometers south of the ridge on the morning of day 13. The plan was specific, and the timing was tight, and neither of them discussed what happened if one of them didn't arrive at the endpoint. There was no point discussing it. They both knew the math. Tessa's route took her through a border crossing that FAM had used twice, a crossing that was officially closed for renovation and unofficially staffed by a guard named something she was never told, who had a practical relationship with the concept of official documentation. She crossed in the bed of a truck carrying construction equipment, covered by a tarp that smelled like diesel and old blood. And she did not move for 6 hours, and she counted the seconds in her head to keep herself from thinking about the temperature. She was thinking about the notebook. Specifically, she was thinking about the shot she had fired on day 1, the shot that had been logged as a miss. It was not a miss. The target had been a tracking device, not a person, a device attached to the underside of a vehicle at the coordinate marker that she had identified as the point where the mapping divergence was largest. The device had been transmitting. After her shot, it stopped transmitting. She had calculated the angle and the distance in under 4 seconds at altitude, with a wind reading she had taken by watching the movement of dust on a ridge face 300 meters away. The distance was 3,947 meters. She had not reported it because reporting it would have required explaining why she was shooting at a tracking device rather than observing as instructed. And explaining that would have required explaining what the tracking device was connected to, and she had not yet decided who she could trust with that information. She had made the right call. She knew that now. The shot had never been a miss. The shot had destroyed the device before it could relay her position to whoever was monitoring it. If the shot had been a miss, the device would have transmitted her exact location within minutes. She would not have had 11 days on the mountain. She would have had 11 minutes. Dr. Renata Kwan's office at Georgetown was small and precise, with the particular organization of a person who dealt in enormous complexity and needed their immediate physical environment to be simple. Books in exact order, one plant on the windowsill, well tended, a whiteboard with 3 columns of notes in handwriting so small it looked like code from the doorway. She looked up when Tessa knocked on the open door. She took in the woman in front of her, the weathering, the controlled movement, the notebook held flat against the chest, and she did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Close the door." Tessa came in and closed the door. "Pham sent word you were coming," Quan said. "I didn't know if I should believe him." "You shouldn't have," Tessa said, "until now." Quan nodded once. She rose from behind her desk and went to the whiteboard and looked at her 3 columns of notes. "I've been working this from the contracting side for 4 years," she said. "I can show shell company structures, I can show money flows, I can show the anomalies in the procurement records. What I cannot show is intent. I cannot show operational use. Without that, it's a financial irregularity case, and financial irregularity cases at this level get managed. They don't get prosecuted. The notebook shows intent," Tessa said. "The device I neutralized shows operational concealment. Pham's documentation shows the full structure." She set the notebook on Quan's desk. "And I can testify to the shot, the distance, and the calculation under oath before any tribunal that has jurisdiction to hear it." Quan looked at the notebook. She did not reach for it yet. "Do you understand what you're setting in motion?" "Yes. These are not small people. I know. Your career." "I spent 11 days on a mountain that someone put me on intentionally," Tessa said. "My career is a secondary concern." Quan was quiet for a moment. Outside, the Georgetown campus moved in its ordinary afternoon way, students and bicycles, and the ordinary machinery of an institution that had been processing the nation's complications for over 200 years. Inside, the room was very still. "I'll need to verify the documentation before I engage the Inspector General's office," Quan said. "That takes time. During that time, you need to be somewhere that is not obvious. I have options." "Pham?" "Separate location, we agreed it was better." Quan finally reached for the notebook. She opened it carefully, looked at the first page of coordinates, and her expression did something that Tessa recognized. The specific reaction of someone who has been building a case in partial darkness and is suddenly seeing the piece that makes everything else make sense. "How long did it take you to record this?" Quan asked. 4 days on the mountain before the extraction was aborted," Tessa said, "and about 30 years of paying attention. What happened next did not happen quickly because real things rarely do." Quan spent 3 weeks verifying the documentation, cross-referencing Tessa's notebooks against Pham's device. Against the contracting records she had spent 4 years accumulating, against satellite imagery from a commercial provider that she accessed through a university research account in a way that was technically within the terms of service and practically irreproducible. The case she assembled was not a leak. It was not a press conference. It was a referral, formal, documented, submitted through the Office of the Inspector General of the Department of Defense, with a cover letter that ran 14 pages and cited 47 specific regulatory provisions. The referral included a witness disclosure form signed by Tessa Rourke and a sealed declaration from a source, identified only as a former intelligence officer with direct knowledge of operational activities under Whiteframe. Vos was placed on administrative leave 11 days after the referral was submitted. Not arrested, placed on leave, which is how these things begin, slowly and in the language of process rather than justice. Streck resigned 3 weeks later, citing personal reasons. Her resignation was accepted without comment. The Deputy Assistant Secretary, whose name had never appeared in any document, did not resign. He was transferred. The transfer was lateral, and the announcement was buried in a personnel notice that no major outlet covered. Tessa read about it in a database she accessed through Quan's university login. And she read it twice, and she felt the specific dissatisfaction of someone who understands that what they accomplished was real, even though it doesn't look like what they imagined. That was fine. She had not gotten into this work because she expected it to look like what she imagined. Pham surfaced 4 months after their separation, officially. His death in action designation was quietly revised to classified active duty status, which was a bureaucratic phrase that meant someone had decided his survival was more useful than his martyrdom. He called Tessa once from a number she didn't recognize and said, "Quan tells me the referral held." "Most of it," Tessa said. "Most of it is more than zero." Yes, there was a pause. "The shot," Pham said. "The one from day one, 3,947 meters." "Yes, I ran the numbers," he said. "On the wind conditions, the angle, the altitude adjustment." "And?" Another pause, shorter this time. "I just wanted you to know I ran them." She understood what he meant. The numbers confirmed what she had known, that the shot was not luck, not instinct, not approximation, it was calculation. Exact, deliberate, and correct. The kind of shot that most people would look at and call impossible because they hadn't seen all the work that made it inevitable. "Thank you," she said. "Don't mention it," Pham said, and ended the call. She was back at Fort Bragg by spring, assigned to a training role that was officially an honor and practically a form of institutional observation. The Army's way of keeping someone close while it decided what to make of them. She taught long-range marksmanship to a cohort of 12 students who ranged from genuinely gifted to technically competent, and she taught it the way she had learned everything, by insisting on the mathematics before anything else. Not the mechanics, the mathematics. Stance and trigger discipline and breath control were teachable in a week. Understanding why the bullet went where it went, at that distance, with that wind, at that altitude, that took longer. That took the willingness to treat every variable as a known rather than an excuse. Most people looked at a long-range miss and said wind, or mirage, or human error. Tessa had looked at every miss she had ever seen and asked what the shooter failed to calculate. There was always an answer. The answer was always a number. On the last day of the training block, one of her students, a young specialist named Davia Okonkwo, 23 years old, from Akron, who had the best natural spatial reasoning Tessa had seen in a decade of watching people try, made a shot at 2,200 meters on the first attempt. The conditions were difficult. The wind was variable. She had been told beforehand by two other instructors that 2,200 was unreasonable for this stage. Okonkwo had asked Tessa what she thought. Tessa had said, "Run the numbers. If the numbers say it's possible, then it's possible. Ignore everything else." Okonkwo had run the numbers. Okonkwo had made the shot. Afterward, when the range had cleared and the other students were logging their results, Okonkwo came over to where Tessa was standing and said, simply, "I didn't know the numbers could do that." Tessa looked out at the target, 2,200 meters downrange, a small thing at this distance, barely visible without optics. But visible. "They can do more than that," she said. "They can keep you alive on a mountain for 11 days. They can tell you what someone is trying to hide by measuring what's missing. They can build a case that survives people who don't want it to survive." She handed Okonkwo's notebook back to her. "Learn the numbers first. Everything else comes after." What Tessa did not say, because it was not the kind of thing you said out loud in a place like this, was that the numbers had been the only thing she'd trusted completely when everything else had been taken from her. Not the chain of command. Not the official coordinates. Not the helicopter that didn't come. The numbers had told the truth when nothing else did. That was the only kind of reliability that had ever mattered to her, and it was the only kind she had ever been able to offer back.